Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's a delight to be with you. And I feel I should apologize that it's taken 60 years of my life before I came to Switzerland. But shame, I know. I have really enjoyed my first visit. Thank you for the chocolate, not just here at the conference, but all the chocolate I've enjoyed from Switzerland all through my life. Thank you for the ambience of this conference, which has been very special. I don't think, have anything like it in the UK, and I've really been excited by the synergy of bringing together leaders from a variety of contexts, business and politics and the church, to engage together. Thank you for the wisdom that's emerged. Thank you for the music and the drama, which has been really exciting and interesting. And thank you for the thoughts of the panel this morning on what makes a good sermon. No pressure whatsoever as I was listening to what you were saying. I have been in ordained ministry in the Church of England for all of my working life. Some of you may say I've never had a proper job in the sense that you would understand it. I spent 13 years in parish ministry as the minister of a local church in my hometown in Halifax in the north of England, a very poor community where my dad grew up. I've spent 8 years training clergy in Durham in the very north of England. As was said in the introduction, I then spent 5 years setting up and leading a new initiative called Fresh Expressions, which is about developing new forms of church close to where people are. And then for 7 years was Bishop of Sheffield in the north before moving 2 years ago to Oxford. For those of you who have no idea what a Church of England bishop is or does, I don't now have a local church responsibility. My job is to watch over a diocese which covers 3 counties of England, has a population of 2.5 million people, and I guess we have somewhere near 1,000 churches and chaplaincies and schools, about 600 clergy, a budget for our churches of around 24 million, and about the same for the schools that we operate directly. And I work with a great big team of people who make all of that possible. And I am also one of the 26 Church of England bishops who sit in the House of Lords. And my principal work there is this year serving on a select committee, a special inquiry into artificial intelligence. So I was very interested in some of the debates that have been going on about technology and the digital world and the ethics of that. I'm married to Anne. I have 4 children who are adult, 2 boys and 2 girls. I have 3 grandsons, and they are called, who are a delight. The oldest is 3, and they are called Josiah and Judah and Joshua. Number 4 is on the way, and we're waiting to see. We know he's a boy. We're waiting to see what he'll be called. And I'm feeling increasingly like a patriarch as I grow older. I've been the normal family cook for all our married life, and I bake my own bread. That's my other claim to fame. Thank you. So let me begin by telling you about the most challenging sermon I ever heard. I don't think I've ever told this story in public before, but I thought, praying about it today, that this was something I should share with you. The most challenging sermon I've ever heard. I was around 37 years of age, so it's 23 years ago. Married, 4 children, aged 10 and under. The minister of a local church, one local church. God was blessing the ministry, the church was growing, people were coming to faith. But as is common in those situations, I had far too much to do and I was really stretched. And I took 100 or so people from the church away for a weekend with their families, and looking after your own family of little children who constantly, as it seemed, misbehaved, and the church family is very stretching. And we had this weekend away. We came back for an evening service at the church for the church members who'd been away and the church members who'd not. The man we'd invited to come for the weekend with us couldn't be there, so he'd sent a substitute, somebody I didn't know. And the guest preacher took some words from the prophet Jeremiah for his text. It was as though he was speaking straight to my heart as he read them and unfolded them. And I've never forgotten his talk. It really is the most challenging sermon I've ever heard. Jeremiah has an honest relationship with God, you know, if you read the text at all of the book of Jeremiah. And the context of these verses is one of Jeremiah's complaints to God. He is moaning, really, back to God. God, life is very difficult. Things are not working out for me. Why don't you do something? Please, God, whatever you're doing, get on with it. I paraphrase, but he is moaning and complaining. And God replies, and these are God's words. If you have raced with foot runners and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? And if in a safe land you fall down, how will you fare in the thickets by the Jordan? God is challenging Jeremiah, his prophet. If you think this is hard, wait and see. Wait and see what's around the corner. In my case, speaking to my younger self, if you find this one church and this one challenge difficult, how will you cope when the responsibility becomes greater? You can see why it was the most challenging sermon I've ever listened to. In the beginning, I found the words really difficult to hear. But over time, I didn't hear God's words to Jeremiah as harsh, but as gentle. An encouragement really to lift up my head and see the wider horizon and see what more God might be calling me to. And in fact, they shook me out of my introspection and self-pity. I was in all truth overstretched by my present responsibilities. More accurately, I was overstretched not by the responsibilities themselves, but by the way I was inhabiting and living those responsibilities. That sermon reminded me that there might be yet further challenges to come, and they would probably be more difficult and require greater capacity and love and courage and endurance. And part of my responsibility in watching over myself was to see that capacity for leadership grow and be ready and prepared for what was to come. I guess everybody here is familiar with leadership insights from the social sciences and from business schools and the extensive literature on leadership. All of us will have learned something from those sources through MBAs and courses and conferences of different kinds. But we may not be as aware that there is a much older and deeper tradition of reflection on leadership in communities. And I like to use the picture of a deserted, neglected mine shaft in the shadow of the bright lights of the business school. The shaft is very deep when you come to look in it. It goes back more than 3,000 years of reflection. And I'm talking, of course, about the Judeo-Christian tradition, the biblical tradition, and all that's flowed from it, of reflection on leadership. I think it's the longest continuous tradition of reflection on how to lead in communities that human culture has ever known. 3,000 years of reflecting on the same stories and texts and applying them in different ways. The shaft is deep. At its base, if you look down it, there are the ancient Old Testament traditions, the scriptures. There is law, and there is story, and there is history. There is ancient myth and poetry. There are the Psalms, which lay bare human emotion and the human heart and give us a vocabulary for life's experiences and our relationship with God. There is the person of Jesus Christ at the very center of the tradition. Jesus, the Messiah, the King who is to come, the leader who lays down power and authority. And flowing from the scriptures and from Christ, there are writings from every age and era of the church, sifting and distilling and applying the wisdom of scripture and contemporary reflection. And what I'm saying is that this mine is not covered up and unknown only to the social sciences and the business school. You could imagine there are reasons for that. But this deep, deep mine is covered over and hidden and obscure even in the life of the church. We have neglected it. We do not know it deeply, and we need to recover it. Far too much Christian reflection on leadership is simple proof texting. We believe something to be true, and we go and find a Bible verse to show that it has some connection with Scripture. It doesn't arise from deep knowledge of the Scriptures and the Christian tradition. For if it did, it would be life-changing. At the heart of this great tradition, which goes back all of those years, I want to suggest to you there is one single, powerful insight which is deeply countercultural to a contemporary understanding of leadership, and particularly countercultural to the most popular literature on leadership today. And it's this. Leadership in communities, the Christian tradition says, is very, 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 very difficult. That's countercultural because most social science literature and most popular literature on leadership tries to make out that this business of leading organizations or businesses or leading in life is really very simple and straightforward. If only you read my book, pay to come to my seminar, and do these 5 things which normally all begin with P, then your success is assured. But this insight is foundational to the many different stories of leaders in the scriptures. If you read the Bible, you're not presented with heroes other than Jesus Christ. We are presented in the Bible with anti-heroes, people who mess up, and who particularly mess up when exercising power and leadership. Even the good leaders, like Abraham and Moses and Peter, are manifestly imperfect. Many of those who begin well are corrupted, and their lives are distorted by the power and responsibility they wield. Just think for a moment of King Saul and King David and King Solomon. Each shows great promise early in life. In each, the promise is not fulfilled. Saul attains the kingship. His insecurities are instantly exposed when he is in that position of responsibility. His court is corrupted by jealousy, which flows from him as the leader. No sooner has David become established in his kingdom than his desire for Bathsheba leads to adultery, and then to murder, and then to division in his family, and then to civil war in his kingdom. Solomon begins well and seeks wisdom in humility, yet over time he surrounds himself with those who lead his heart away from the God of Israel and becomes blind to the suffering of his people. And by his neglect, Solomon sows the seeds of the division of the kingdom he has worked so hard to establish. It's not so hard to think of contemporary examples in any sphere of leadership of jealousy and court intrigue playing on leaders' insecurities. It's not hard to think of examples, particularly not over the last year, of the toxic mix of sex and unequal power affecting leadership in different ways. It's not hard to think of leaders who become too involved in what they're doing and too isolated from their communities. And the core insight of leadership continues into the New Testament. Even with the example of Christ, the leaders of the early church are too fallible and imperfect. And this fundamental insight on leadership then becomes, as it were, the cornerstone of the writings on leadership in the communities of the church which follow the New Testament period in the first 600 years of the church. Leadership is very difficult and very demanding. Therefore, a fundamental strand in developing leadership is to watch over your inner life. The Acts of the Apostles is written by the author of Luke's Gospel, and it tells the story of the early church from the day of Pentecost through to Paul preaching in Rome. There are three main sections to the book, and the central section, chapters 12 to 20, tell the story of the way Paul and his companions plant churches through Cyprus and Macedonia and Turkey and Macedonia and into Greece. And at the end of this section of the book, in a very important place in Acts, Luke has Paul make a speech to the ministers of those churches, especially from Ephesus. Ancient historians have a convention of bringing their history alive with speeches. And Paul makes this speech on the beach to the presbyters, the ministers, from the churches in Ephesus. It's a wonderful and very moving speech, and 3 times in the narrative and the speech, Paul has Luke mention tears and weeping, a clue to the difficulty of leadership. Paul explores some of the difficulties and challenges which are behind him and ahead of them. And he articulates a response to that in their own leadership. He doesn't just say, it's been difficult for me, it's going to be difficult for you, I'm off now, goodbye. He actually offers them a fundamental way to think about this challenge. Because leadership is so difficult, this is what you must do. This is what you must do. Keep watch over yourselves and over the whole flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. The Greek word is episkopoi, from which we eventually get the English word bishop, and it means to watch over. Keep watch over yourselves and over the whole flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. They're deceptively simple words, and they're probably familiar, but try and ponder them. Those words will go on to shape the entire Christian tradition of writing and teaching and understanding what it means to lead in communities. If we would lead others, if we want to grow in our own responsibilities, if we would be safe leaders, then we must continually take responsibility for ourselves and watch over ourselves before we watch over the flock, the organization, the country, the multinational corporation. Paul's words from Acts go on to be part of all Christian formation and leadership. They are quoted in every liturgy of ordination when people are commissioned to new tasks, and every prayer for Christian leaders. And in particular, they shape the tradition of reflection on leadership in the early centuries of the church, both in the East and in the West. There's a remarkable trilogy of books which contain this tradition. In the 4th century, somebody called Gregory of Nazianzen wrote a treatise on the difficulty of church leadership called In Defense of His Flight to Pontus. A little later, John Chrysostom, also in the East, in Constantinople, wrote some books on priesthood. And then 200 years later again, and using this earlier tradition, Gregory the Great, when he has just become Pope, writes his seminal book called The Pastoral Rule. Each of their books is shaped by this short quotation from St. Paul. And each begins with the same story, but told in different ways. Each of these 3 books is written, the authors say, to set out the reasons why the person writing the book, when invited to assume leadership in the church, ran away and physically fled to a far country, as far as they could go, because this is so very difficult. And they write their books to explain why, when the people came to get them, to ordain them bishop, they set off for a far country. And then each book is in 2 parts. The first is concerned with watching over yourself, and the second focuses on what we might call skills for leadership, the acquiring and outworking of knowledge and practice. For hundreds of years in Europe, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Rule was the foundation of reading and reflection on leadership in the Western tradition, alongside the rule of Benedict, inside and outside the church. I think it's got some claim to be the most influential text on leadership ever written. And today it's neglected and unread even in many parts of the church. And in our contemporary thinking about leadership, we have lifted up the importance of skills and knowledge, but we have neglected the importance of character formation and development and the challenges to the self of the exercise of power. Here is one of Gregory's metaphors on leadership and its challenges. He writes, "And indeed, what else is power in the post of superiority, in a senior role, but a tempest of the mind? What is power except a storm in your head, wherein the ship of the heart is ever shaken by hurricanes of thought and is ceaselessly driven to and fro, until by sudden excesses of words and deeds it founders on confronting rocks." This seems to be, to me, such a powerful description of the multiple stresses of leadership, overwhelming the mind and good judgment, and leading to breakdown or disaster, which may be inner for the leader or outward for the organization or community. So, how do we grow in our leadership so that we're able to watch over ourselves and over the communities we lead with integrity, and so that we're able to grow in capacity as we grow in life and grow through all the challenges around us and not be overwhelmed? Let me offer you a very homely, ordinary image. When I was 11 years old, I was offered a place at a grammar school, a senior school. You had to pass an exam to get in. One of the challenges of going to a grammar school, as the first member of my family to do so, was the cost to my parents of the uniform, and especially of the jacket, the school blazer. Boys of 11 grow very rapidly and unpredictably. And the normal pattern for our classmates, for everybody, in those days, is that our parents would buy at 11 a jacket for us which was several sizes too large. So the sleeves would be down here, and the jacket would probably come to the knees, and actually below the shorts that we had to wear to go with it. And we would grow into the jacket over 2 or 3 years. So that way there was no need to buy an expensive new jacket every time we grew a couple of inches. And I can very, very clearly remember putting on my first school blazer, and that sense that it was several sizes too big. I had to grow in order to fill it. Well, in every transition in leadership in my life, I have revisited my 11-year-old self. And every change has felt, from the inside, like putting on a jacket, which is several sizes too big. I've needed to grow and deepen. Not physically, though from time to time in my life I have grown physically and have needed to reduce, but in terms of my inner life, in order to respond well to the challenges that each task brings. And I'm still growing. And I'm still learning. And it is much better to acknowledge that. The temptation in any new role is to exude confidence and competence, which all too often we do not yet have. It's much better to be honest, to put on our L plates again, and to admit that we have a great deal to learn. And as I've pondered the shape of the great Christian tradition on leadership over many years now, I find it helpful to think of the learning and growing and the exercise of that leadership in a particular way, in 4 different domains. And all 4 sum up for me what it means to exercise leadership. I've worked with the model for around 14 years now in terms of my own practice, and shared it in many contexts in the church and outside. I share it with you now. Watching over yourself is the heart of the Christian tradition of leadership. Ensuring the leadership I offer has integrity and balance. The leadership I bring and the influence I offer is put into effect in my leadership of individuals and teams, the second domain, and also in the influence I offer across the organization as a whole, through such things as vision and strategy and good stewardship of resources. And the fourth domain is outward-facing leadership. I'm continually called, I think in any role, to look beyond the organization I'm leading to the wider world and to God's purposes within the world. And it might be helpful just for a moment for you to map the leadership you currently offer and the things you've been doing this week or next week onto those 4 domains and see where your energy lies, and especially what area you might be neglecting at the expense of the others. So these are some of the things I've been doing this week and will do next week, investing energy from the outside in outward-facing leadership. I'm spending 2 days this coming week focusing on artificial intelligence and its impact on society through the final meeting of the committee I'm on in the House of Lords, and then through a symposium drawing together people from different perspectives within the life of the church, university researchers and people from industry looking at the ethics on AI. I'm also looking outwards in that this time next week I'll be making an address in my own diocese on Christian care for the environment and reasons for that. So that's the fourth domain. In the area of the third domain, leading the organization, I was, this time last week, I was spending time with clergy and congregations in one area of my diocese as we develop fresh vision and strategy and priorities for the next period in our common life. We feel strongly called to be a more Christ-like church and put that at the center of our calling, and we're exploring together in the beautiful words in the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel what it might mean to be more contemplative as a church, more compassionate as a church, and more courageous as a church in this next part of our life together. In terms of the second domain, this last week I spent a great deal of time with my immediate team in routine planning and in training that we've been doing together. I've had a significant number of one-to-one conversations with clergy and senior colleagues, and I've been concerned for a number of individuals who are bearing a great deal at the moment. And then there's a central domain, because all of that would not be possible week after week, month after month, unless I'd also this week taken time at the beginning of each day, substantial time, for silence and prayer and reflection. I've written in my journal several times this week because I have been dealing with particularly demanding situations. When colleagues have asked me how I am, I've not just brushed off their questions, I've taken time to answer them and treat them seriously and be honest. I've taken time off as well as working. I've taken time to read because that's how I'm stretched and replenished. And I've been to the gym twice, as it happens. I feel very satisfied saying that. So I don't know what your map would look like and where the balance is and where the capacity is growing, but that's mine. And where I wonder, as we look at all the demands upon us as leaders in different spheres, where I wonder does my chief need to learn and reflect lie? And where does yours? Well, I've learned over many, many years that the key challenges, the key growth, the most important learning is not in the outward-facing leadership. It's not in the organizational change. It's not in forming a team or coaching others. The key learning and key challenges take place in the inner domain. As I keep watch over myself, then I am better able, by the grace of God, and only by the grace of God, to watch over and to lead the community which God has called me to serve and lead and represent. There is, as we know, a shadow side to all our leadership, a difficult piece. Things which challenge and stretch us beyond our capacity. And as I've become a little more senior in leadership responsibilities and grown older, then I become even more aware of the challenge to continue to grow in those capacities as we continue through life. And I suppose I become aware of two groups of people who, in different ways, cease to do this. There is one group, the first group, who neglect to watch over themselves and become obviously overwhelmed with the storms and crises of different kinds in Gregory's picture. And those storms and crises build up, and sometimes the ending is spectacular and sometimes it's hidden from view, but it's always tragic. They become burned out or overwhelmed in one way or another. The Bible uses a very powerful image to describe these forces of chaos, which Gregory is using in that quotation. It's the force of storm and water and wind and wave, deeply rooted in the Old Testament from the creation narrative onwards. In the theology of most of the Old Testament, storm and water are bad things. They represent forces of unpredictability and chaos. And the sea is a force of chaos which often overwhelms us. And leadership of large organizations in an unpredictable world often feels overwhelming in its size or complexity, or because our public persona somehow swamps our individual identity. One of the strong metaphors for leadership in the Old Testament is in the first chapter of Genesis, and it's the metaphor of God bringing order out of chaos. in creation. To lead is to bring order, to divide things up and sort things out, and just allow people to see where they fit in the picture. And the calming of the inner storm through times of contemplation and reflection, so we live from the inside out. So one group of people become, as it were, swamped and overwhelmed by that storm and force of chaos, and will often need rehabilitation and to grow again from that base. But there is a second group of people who behave differently. Those are the people who become so overwhelmed by the challenges of leadership that they may not have an outward crisis, but they step back from the front line and the difficult decisions and resign themselves to inaction. It's particularly true of people when they approach in their final role and when they're approaching retirement. They remain in office and in their jobs, but they are not leading. The pain and the difficulty and the jeopardy have defeated them and overwhelmed them and paralyzed them in different ways. And all they want to do is see out their time. And sometimes that can happen quite early in life. I had a conversation some years ago with a vicar in his 40s who'd served 12 years in a really difficult parish. And he was really trying to say to me through this conversation that he had now fulfilled his calling and was looking at what to me should be the prime of his life, to scale down his responsibilities. And I wanted and actually did reflect back to him that perhaps God's calling to him, echoing those words of Jeremiah, was yes, to step back and find a sabbatical and be renewed, but to be prepared for a still deeper calling to come. And I think those are the leaders addressed in those words from Jeremiah with which I began. If you have raced with foot runners and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? And if in a safe land you fall down, how will you fare in the thickets by the Jordan? They remind us that one of the primary callings of leadership in every generation, in every organization, is courage. To lead from the heart. The English word courage, the French word is from the same Latin root, comes from cor, the Latin, which means heart. It's heart, wholehearted leadership is courageous leadership. To continually step up to the plate and to offer what you can in God's service and according to your calling. One of the great blessings in the way the Church of England supports people in senior roles is that when we make a transition into a senior role now, we are given a coach to work with in transition for a year. And I've been very blessed in the person I've worked with over this last year. I've got my last session with him this week. And we have identified together that the thing I most needed to work on in a transition from my previous diocese to the present diocese was, of course, an inward something. And it was this area of courage of continually stepping up to the plate. One of my prevailing tendencies through ministry is self-doubt and constantly questioning myself. And there are some good sides to that, but it can also prevent you reaching your full potential in the ministry to which God has called you. And so we've done a lot of work on how to be bold and wholehearted in the leadership we offer. And courage is hard to exercise. When our lives are unbalanced, when we're exhausted, when we're overwhelmed. And it's hard to exercise when we're simply afraid and vulnerable and feel we've failed or will fail. In those circumstances, a lot of courage is to do with coming to terms with the things which haven't worked out, as we heard very eloquently in the testimonies yesterday evening. But in all of those circumstances, the way forward will be in rest and retreat and replenishment and renewal. Our calling as Christian leaders, in whatever sphere God calls us, is to live in good rhythms of prayer and rest and work and community. But our calling is not, I suggest, to quiet lives. Our calling is to love God's world and seek transformation and turn the world upside down, as our forebears have done. And for that, we need to hear God's call to adventurous and courageous leadership. And so I leave this verse with you. If you have raced with foot runners and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? And if in a safe land you fall down, how will you fare in the thickets by the Jordan? Thank you.